The Doctor and the Dying Girl. Dr. Benjamin Foster stood in the silence of his backyard garden, the early morning sun casting golden streaks through the branches. The soft hum of distant birds and the rhythmic snip of his pruning shears were the only sounds accompanying him. At 63, he had aged gracefully, though the silver in his hair and the creases around his sharp blue eyes carried the weight of time and loss. His hands, once steady and precise in an operating room, now delicately tended to his rose bushes, carefully trimming away the overgrowth. The act was mechanical, a habit formed over the past 5 years since his wife, Melinda, had passed. Melinda had loved these roses. She had spent hours tending to them, coaxing them into bloom with the same gentle patience she had used to comfort him after long, grueling nights in the ER. Now, without her, the house felt cold, lifeless. A gust of wind rustled through the yard, making the branches sway, as if whispering memories of a past he could never quite escape. His career as a surgeon had been remarkable, one of the best trauma specialists in the country, with a reputation for making the impossible possible. But all of that felt meaningless when he couldn't save the one person he had loved the most. His hand stilled, the shears slipping from his grip. The familiar pang of grief clenched his chest like a fist. No matter how many years passed, Melinda's absence was an open wound that refused to heal. He sighed and turned toward the house, the empty space within beckoning him like a hollow echo. Just as he reached for the door handle, a sound from the past sliced through his thoughts. A scream. Not a scream from his garden, but from his memories. A desperate, terrified scream. One he had heard in an emergency room 15 years ago. The ER at St. Mary's Hospital was in chaos. BP dropping fast. A nurse called out, "Get me an intubation kit now." Dr. Foster barked, his hands already moving with precision. A 12-year-old girl lay on the hospital bed, her small frame trembling violently. Her skin was covered in angry red hives, her lips swelling rapidly. Her body was shutting down before his eyes. Her mother, Carla, stood at the foot of the bed, sobbing. "Please, somebody help her." Dr. Foster barely spared her a glance as he focused on the girl. "Name?" "T. Tasha," the nurse stammered, handing him the intubation kit. "Tasha, listen to me," he said, his voice calm yet firm, though he knew she was barely conscious. "We're going to help you breathe, okay? Stay with me, kiddo." Her eyelids fluttered, her chest rising and falling in weak, erratic movements. Adrenaline flooded his veins, but his hands remained steady. Epinephrine, 0.3 milligrams. Now. A nurse pressed the injection into the girl's thigh, but her oxygen levels continued to plummet. Her throat was closing fast. "No response to epinephrine," a nurse confirmed, her voice strained. Dr. Foster's jaw clenched. They were running out of time. "She needs to be intubated immediately," he said, grabbing the scope. He worked quickly, his mind sharp, his body acting from years of experience. The moment the tube slid into place, the machines beeped in response, her oxygen levels stabilizing, though still dangerously low. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Let's get antihistamines on board and keep her under observation," he ordered, stepping back. He turned to the girl's mother. She was sobbing but watching him with wide, desperate eyes. "She's going to be okay," he said, his voice softer now. "We'll monitor her, but she's stable." Carla's knees buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of the hospital bed. "Oh God. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Foster." He gave her a small nod, but inside, he felt the familiar weight pressing against his ribs, the burden of saving lives. He had done his job. He had saved the girl. But somehow, in the years that followed, he had lost himself. Benjamin blinked, shaken from his memories, back in the present, in his quiet garden. He exhaled sharply and rubbed his face, as if trying to wipe away the past. The life he had left behind was nothing more than a collection of moments, glorious victories and devastating losses, all swirling together in a haze of what-ifs. With a final glance at the roses, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. What he didn't know was that the past he had tried so hard to escape was coming back for him. And soon, someone from that very night, the little girl he had once saved, would knock on his door. A knock at the door. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across Benjamin Foster's quiet neighborhood. The gentle hum of the outside world drifted through the window of his living room. The distant chatter of children playing, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint honk of a car somewhere down the street. It was a world that had moved on without him, a life that he had once been a part of but had long since withdrawn from. He sat in his worn armchair, staring blankly at the book in his lap. It had been open to the same page for nearly an hour, his mind unable to absorb the words. His thoughts wandered back to the past, back to the ER, back to the life he had abandoned. Just as his eyelids began to grow heavy with exhaustion, a sudden firm knock at the door jolted him awake. Benjamin frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors had become a rarity since he retired. His colleagues had stopped calling after years of unanswered invitations. His neighbors knew better than to disturb the man who preferred solitude, and his patience. Well, he no longer had any patience. A second knock followed, insistent and deliberate. His chest tightened with unease. With a deep sigh, he rose from his chair, his knees aching with the effort. He made his way toward the door, hesitant, as though something about this moment was different, something unfamiliar yet oddly significant. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with a young woman. She stood tall, her frame lean but strong, her dark brown skin illuminated by the fading sunlight. Her eyes, deep, knowing, and filled with an energy he couldn't quite place, held his gaze with unwavering intensity. Her hair was neatly pulled back into a ponytail, and she wore a simple yet professional outfit, exuding quiet confidence. "Dr. Foster," she asked softly, a small, almost nervous smile forming on her lips. Benjamin hesitated, gripping the edge of the door as if bracing himself. It had been a long time since someone had called him that. "Yes," he answered cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman's smile widened. "You already have." There was a brief silence, thick with something unspoken, something waiting to be unearthed. Benjamin studied her features, his mind working through the possibilities. There was something eerily familiar about her, a shadow of a memory that he couldn't quite bring into focus. She saw the confusion in his eyes and took a small step forward. "You saved my life 15 years ago," she said. "I was just a kid, a little girl named Tasha." Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. Tasha. The name alone pulled him straight back to that chaotic night in the ER. The swelling, the struggle to breathe, the frantic mother begging for help. His grip on the door tightened, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. He had saved so many people in his career. Faces blurred together, names faded with time. He had tried to forget them, not because he didn't care, but because caring had become too painful. But this girl, this woman, stood here now, living, breathing, because of him. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how dry it had become. "Tasha, I remember." A warmth spread across her face, a look of relief mixed with something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe something else entirely. "I've been looking for you," she admitted, her voice carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "For a long time." Benjamin's brow furrowed. "Looking for me?" She nodded. "I never got the chance to thank you properly. And I have something important to tell you." His first instinct was to retreat, to close the door and let the past remain where it belonged. But something in Tasha's voice stopped him. A feeling, a whisper of something unfinished. With a heavy sigh, he stepped back and gestured toward the living room. "Come in." Tasha sat on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she took in her surroundings. The room was tidy but void of life. No family photos, no signs of warmth or welcome. Just books, medical journals gathering dust, and an air of quiet loneliness that made her chest ache. Benjamin sat across from her in his armchair, watching her carefully, trying to piece together why she was here. "You really don't know how hard you were to find," Tasha said with a small laugh. Benjamin huffed. That was intentional. Her smile faded slightly. "I figured as much." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken words. Benjamin leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why now, Tasha?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "After all these years, why come looking for me?" Tasha took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the fabric of her pants as if steadying herself. "Because you changed my life." Benjamin remained still, listening. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the weight she carried in her expression. "After that night in the ER, everything shifted for me. I realized how precious life was, how fragile it could be. And because of you, because you fought for me, I decided I wanted to help people too." Benjamin's expression softened. "I became a motivational speaker," she continued, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "I travel, I speak at schools, hospitals, conferences. I tell my story, your story." Benjamin inhaled slowly, his fingers pressing into the armrest of his chair. He wasn't sure what he had expected her to say, but it wasn't this. Tasha laughed softly, shaking her head. "You don't realize it, do you? You saved me, Dr. Foster. And because of that, I've been able to help so many others." He swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. "Tasha, I was just doing my job." She sighed, her gaze unwavering. "You always say that, don't you? Like saving lives was just some routine task." Benjamin had no response. Tasha leaned forward. "It wasn't just a job. Not to me. Not to my mother. You didn't just save my life that night. You gave me a future. And now, I'm here because I need you again." A chill crept up Benjamin's spine. "Need me?" Tasha's face darkened with worry. "It's my mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's sick, really sick, and no one can figure out how to help her." Benjamin's stomach tightened. "We've been to specialists, tried different treatments, but nothing is working," Tasha continued, desperation creeping into her tone. "And then I thought, maybe the man who saved me once could save her too." Silence. Benjamin's heartbeat was slow, steady, but heavy. "I know you're retired," Tasha added quickly, "and I know this is a lot to ask. But please, Dr. Foster, you were the only one who could save me, and I truly believe you're the only one who can save her." He exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists against his knees. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had left that life behind for a reason. He had walked away from the weight of holding someone's fate in his hands. And yet, he looked at Tasha, this woman who had grown into someone strong, someone determined, someone alive because of him. And he knew, deep down, that no matter how much he tried to run from it, he couldn't turn her away. Not now. Not when someone still needed him. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, meeting Tasha's pleading gaze. "I'll take a look," he said finally. Tasha exhaled in relief, nodding rapidly. "Thank you, Dr. Foster." But as Benjamin sat there, the weight of what he had just agreed to settling over him, he wondered, had he just stepped back into a world that had nearly destroyed him? And if so, would he be strong enough to face it again? The weight of returning. Benjamin Foster stood in front of the hospital room door, his hand frozen just inches from the handle. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind, all screaming at him to turn around, to walk away before it was too late. This was a mistake. He wasn't a doctor anymore. He wasn't the man he had once been. And yet, behind this door, a woman was fighting for her life. A woman whose daughter had once fought for every breath because of an allergic reaction that nearly killed her. A woman whose daughter had searched for Benjamin because she believed with unwavering certainty that he was the only one who could help. He closed his eyes, taking a slow breath. Tasha stood beside him, watching his hesitation. She didn't rush him, didn't push. She simply waited, her presence a quiet reminder that he wasn't in this alone. With a final exhale, Benjamin pushed the door open. The room was sterile and dimly lit, the steady beep of machines filling the silence. Carla lay in the hospital bed, her body thinner than he remembered, her skin pale. An oxygen tube rested beneath her nose, and the IV attached to her arm dripped fluids into her system at a slow, rhythmic pace. She was awake but weak, her eyes fluttering open as they stepped inside. "Tasha." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm here, Mom," Tasha said softly, rushing to her side. She reached for her mother's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Carla's eyes shifted slowly, landing on Benjamin. A faint smile played at her lips. "Dr. Foster," she murmured, "is it really you?" Benjamin nodded, feeling an odd lump form in his throat. "Hello, Carla." She gave a weak chuckle. "I never thought I'd see you again." "Neither did I," he thought but didn't say it aloud. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over her vitals. The monitors, the medications hanging from the IV pole. "Can I?" he asked, motioning toward her chart on the bedside table. Tasha nodded, handing it to him. Benjamin flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Oxygen levels fluctuating. White blood cell count high. Liver function unstable. Signs of inflammation everywhere. His jaw tightened as he pieced it all together. "What have they diagnosed her with?" he asked. Tasha hesitated before answering. "They don't know." Benjamin's brows furrowed. "They don't know." She shook her head. "We've seen multiple specialists. They've ruled out cancer, infections, autoimmune diseases, but they can't pinpoint exactly what's happening. They've tried treatments, but nothing's working." Benjamin exhaled sharply, flipping through the notes again. The words on the page blurred slightly as his mind raced. This wasn't a simple case, and yet something about it stirred an old instinct within him. Something that had been dormant for years. He was trained for this. He had spent decades solving medical puzzles, finding answers when no one else could. So why was he hesitating? Because last time, you couldn't find the answer, a bitter voice in his head whispered. Last time, you failed. Last time, Melinda died. He forced the thought away, refocusing on the information in front of him. After a moment, he turned back to Carla. "I'd like to run my own tests," he said carefully. "If you're okay with that." Carla smiled weakly. "Dr. Foster, if there's anyone I trust to figure this out, it's you." Her words sent an unexpected pang through his chest. Trust. It had been a long time since anyone had said that to him. He set the chart down, looking between Carla and Tasha. "I'll need full access to her medical history, recent labs, imaging scans, everything. I want to go through it all myself." Tasha nodded quickly. "I'll get you whatever you need." Benjamin glanced at the IV. "And in the meantime, I want to make some immediate changes to her treatment plan. Some of these medications might be doing more harm than good." Tasha's eyes widened with a glimmer of hope. "You think you can help her?" "I think," Benjamin said slowly, "I can figure out what's happening." It wasn't a promise, but it was something. The hospital cafeteria was quiet, the scent of coffee lingering in the air. Benjamin sat at a table near the window, flipping through Carla's medical records. Page after page of test results, lab reports, doctor's notes, all of them inconclusive. He rubbed his forehead, his mind working through the possibilities. Tasha sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee. She watched him in silence, her expression unreadable. "Have you done this before?" she asked finally. He looked up. "Done what?" "Gone back," she said, tilting her head slightly. "After leaving medicine. Have you ever tried to step back in?" Benjamin exhaled, setting the papers down. No, he admitted. Not once. Tasha studied him for a moment. Why did you leave? He hesitated. For years, he had kept the answer buried, hidden away where it couldn't hurt him. But something about Tasha, her quiet persistence, the way she looked at him as if he were still that doctor who saved her, made him feel like he couldn't keep running from it. My wife, he said finally. Melinda. She got sick. And I couldn't save her. Tasha's expression softened. I'm so sorry. Benjamin nodded, his gaze distant. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. I walked away. From medicine, from my career. From everything. Tasha was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward slightly. But you're here now, she said. You came back. Benjamin met her eyes. He wasn't sure why. But as he looked at the files spread out before him, at the woman lying in that hospital bed, and at the daughter who refused to give up, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wanted to save a life again. It was past midnight when Benjamin walked back into Carla's hospital room. She was asleep, her breathing slow but steady. The machines beeped softly, the rhythm of her heartbeat filling the silence. Benjamin sat down in the chair beside her bed, exhaling. He had been staring at medical files for hours, trying to piece together the puzzle. And then, somewhere between old case studies and new lab reports, something had clicked. A possibility. Something no one had considered. He glanced at Carla, at the frailty in her face, the exhaustion in her body. And then, for the first time in 15 years, he felt something stir inside him. Hope. A doctor's hope. The kind that said, I think I know how to save her. The diagnosis that changes everything. The quiet hum of machines filled Carla's hospital room. The lights were dimmed, casting soft shadows along the walls. Benjamin Foster sat in the chair beside her bed, a medical chart in his hands, his fingers tracing over the words on the page. His mind was racing, but his body remained still. Tasha had dozed off in the corner, her exhaustion finally catching up to her after days of relentless worry. She was curled in a chair, arms folded, her breathing deep and steady. Benjamin envied her ability to sleep. He had once been able to function on 3 hours of rest, his mind always sharp, always ready. But tonight, despite his exhaustion, he couldn't close his eyes. Not after what he had just discovered. He glanced up at Carla, her frail body barely moving under the hospital sheets. Her breathing had become shallow, uneven, and he could see the toll the disease had taken on her. It all made sense now. All the misdiagnoses, all the failed treatments. They had been looking in the wrong place. He needed to act fast. But first, he had to tell Tasha. Tasha stirred awake at the sound of movement. She blinked, disoriented, then realized Benjamin was standing over her, his face etched with an urgency she hadn't seen before. Dr. Foster, she mumbled, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. I know what's wrong with your mother, he said without preamble. Tasha sat up straight, fully awake now. What? Benjamin took a breath, pulling a chair up beside her. He laid the chart on the table, tapping a specific section with his finger. I went through all of Carla's previous tests, treatments, and symptoms, he began. Every specialist has been treating this as an immune system disorder or a degenerative disease, but I think they've been looking at it from the wrong angle. Tasha's heart pounded. Then what is it? Benjamin leaned forward, his voice lowering. I believe your mother has a rare condition called paraneoplastic syndrome. Tasha frowned. Paraneoplastic syndrome. What is that? Benjamin steeled himself before explaining. It's a disorder caused by the body's immune system attacking itself in response to a hidden cancer. Essentially, her body is reacting to a tumor, one they haven't been able to find yet. Tasha's breath hitched. A tumor. Benjamin nodded. A very small one, most likely hidden deep within an organ. It's not big enough to show up in scans yet, but her body knows it's there. And because of that, her immune system has been in overdrive, attacking healthy cells. Tasha's mind whirled, the words sinking in slowly. So all this time, her body was reacting to something no one could see. Yes, Benjamin's voice was calm, steady, and that's why none of the treatments have worked. They've been treating the symptoms, but not the root cause. Tasha stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "Can you find it?" she asked quietly. "I think so," Benjamin said. "I want to order a full-body PET scan. If the tumor is there, it should show up. Once we locate it, we can remove it. And your mother's condition should start improving immediately." Tasha's lips parted in shock. It was such a simple solution compared to everything they had been through, all the specialists who had thrown up their hands in defeat. And yet, none of them had figured this out. Only he had. Tears filled her eyes. "You're telling me that you can actually save her?" Benjamin hesitated, then gave a small nod. "If I'm right, and I believe I am, yes, we can save her." Tasha let out a shaky breath, pressing her hands to her face. Relief crashed over her in waves, overwhelming her senses. For the first time in months, she felt hope. She turned back to Benjamin, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to thank you." Benjamin shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go." But even as he said it, something flickered in his expression. A long-buried part of him, the part that had once lived for moments like this, was waking up. And for the first time in years, he felt alive. The scan was scheduled for early the next morning. Benjamin barely slept. He spent the hours leading up to it reviewing Carla's medical history again, making sure he hadn't overlooked anything. He was meticulous in his work, his old habits returning like muscle memory. When Carla was wheeled into the imaging room, he stood beside Tasha, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Tasha watched her mother disappear behind the doors, then turned to Benjamin, her voice tight with mirth. "How long does a PET scan take?" "About an hour," Benjamin answered. "But interpreting the results could take longer." Tasha nodded, then hesitated before asking, "Are you sure about this?" Benjamin met her gaze. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." She let out a breath, gripping her arms as they waited. Benjamin stole a glance at her, something stirring deep within him. 15 years ago, this girl had been dying in an ER bed. He had fought for her, not knowing that one day she would fight just as hard for her mother. And now here they were, together. 3 hours later, Benjamin sat in front of a glowing computer screen, staring at the scan results. And there it was. His jaw tightened, his heart pounding. He had been right. He turned to the radiologist. "How soon can we schedule surgery?" When Benjamin walked into Carla's room, Tasha was already on her feet. She saw his face and gasped. "Did you find it?" Benjamin nodded. "It's small, but it's there. A tumor in her pancreas. That's what's been triggering her immune response." Tasha's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with emotion. Benjamin continued, "We need to act fast. I've spoken with the surgical team. We can operate as soon as tomorrow morning." Carla, weak but listening, gave a tired smile. "So there's hope." Benjamin stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "There's more than hope." Tasha turned to him, and before he could react, she threw her arms around his neck in a tight hug. Benjamin stiffened, startled. But then, slowly, he relaxed. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing himself to feel something. The warmth, the relief, the gratitude. When Tasha pulled away, her eyes were glistening. "Thank you," she whispered. Benjamin swallowed the lump in his throat. "We're not done yet, but we're going to save her." Tasha wiped at her face, nodding. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, he would step back into an operating room for the first time in 15 years. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. The decision that could change everything. The hospital room was filled with an unusual stillness, a calm before the storm of the upcoming surgery. Carla lay resting, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady movements. Tasha sat beside her, holding her mother's hand, her thumb tracing small circles over her skin. Benjamin stood near the window, staring out into the night. The city lights flickered in the distance, but his mind wasn't on the view. It was on what lay ahead. He was stepping back into an operating room tomorrow, a place he had sworn he would never return to. His fingers flexed at his sides, memories of past surgeries rushing back to him, of split-second decisions, of the feeling of a life balanced on the edge, of the weight of success and failure resting in his hands, and of the one time he hadn't been able to save someone. He inhaled sharply, shaking the thought away. He had to do this, because if he didn't, Carla would die. And for the first time in years, Benjamin wanted to fight for someone's life again. Behind him, Tasha stirred, breaking the silence. Dr. Foster. He turned, his face unreadable. Yes. Tasha hesitated. Are you ready for this? It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything he had been running from. His instinct was to say yes, to claim the confidence he had once worn so effortlessly. But he wasn't that man anymore. And so, he told her the truth. I don't know. Tasha studied him for a moment, her brows furrowing. But you're still going to do it, right? Yes. His voice was firm this time. I have to. Tasha nodded slowly. Then that's all that matters. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. I haven't operated in years, Tasha. There are younger, more active surgeons in this hospital. People who've been doing this every day. People with sharper instincts. She didn't flinch. And none of them figured out what was wrong with her. You did. Benjamin's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Because she was right. Tasha sat forward, her gaze steady. You might not have been in an OR for a long time, but I don't believe for 1 second that you forgot how to save a life. Benjamin swallowed hard, her words hitting something deep inside him. Just tell me one thing, Tasha continued. Are your hands still steady? His hands, his most important tool, the part of him that had once been unstoppable. Benjamin looked down at them. He slowly held them out in front of him. Not a single tremor, not even a fraction of doubt. Tasha saw it too. She smiled. Then you're ready. Benjamin lowered his hands, staring at her in quiet awe. She believed in him. After all these years, after everything, she still saw him as the doctor who could do the impossible. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to believe it too. The operating room. The next morning arrived too quickly. Benjamin stood outside the operating room, staring through the small window in the door. Inside, the surgical team was preparing, gloved hands moving swiftly, tools being laid out, the sterile environment of the OR buzzing with quiet efficiency. His heart pounded. He had been here 1,000 times before, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just stepping back into surgery. He was stepping back into who he used to be. A nurse approached him, holding out a surgical gown. Dr. Foster, we're ready when you are. His breath caught. He reached out, fingers curling around the fabric of the gown. A choice stood before him. He could walk away, let another surgeon take over. Or he could fight. For Carla. For Tasha. For the man he used to be. With a slow, steady breath, he pulled the gown over his arms. And as he stepped through the doors, something inside him clicked back into place. He was no longer the broken man hiding in his garden. He was Dr. Benjamin Foster, and he had a life to save. The return of Dr. Foster. The operating room was colder than he remembered. The sterile, clinical scent of antiseptic filled his nose as he stepped through the doors, his every movement deliberate. The bright overhead lights reflected off the gleaming surgical instruments neatly arranged on the table. Machines beeped in rhythmic intervals, tracking Carla's vital signs, the sound pulsing like a countdown in Benjamin's ears. 15 years. 15 years since he last stood here, since he last held a life in his hands. The memories came rushing back all at once. The tense focus, the weight of responsibility, the unrelenting demand for perfection. But there was no time to dwell. He had to be that man again. He had to save Carla. The surgical team was already assembled, their movements efficient, their faces obscured by masks and caps. One of the assisting surgeons, Dr. Whitman, looked up as Benjamin entered, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Dr. Foster," he greeted, nodding respectfully. "It's been a long time." Benjamin nodded back, his face unreadable behind his own mask. "It has." Dr. Whitman studied him briefly before motioning toward the patient on the table. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Benjamin's gaze flickered to Carla, lying unconscious under anesthesia, her vitals steady for now. "I need to do this," he corrected. Dr. Whitman hesitated, then gave a small nod. "All right, let's get started." The scrub nurse handed Benjamin a pair of latex gloves. He took them without hesitation. He pulled them on, flexing his fingers once they were in place. Still steady, still sure. A scalpel was placed in his waiting palm. And just like that, it all came back. The surgery begins. The incision was clean and precise. The surgical field was clear. And Benjamin Foster was no longer a man trapped in the past. He was in the present. His movements were fluid, his mind sharp as he guided the team through each step. "Clamp," he ordered, his voice firm but calm. A nurse responded immediately, placing the instrument in his open hand. He worked methodically, exposing the hidden tumor in Carla's pancreas, the mass small but insidious. It had been lurking there, undetected, wreaking havoc on her body, confusing every doctor who had tried to diagnose her. But he had found it. And now he was going to remove it. "Retract," he instructed, and the assisting surgeon complied. The tension in the room was palpable, but Benjamin felt steady. There was no hesitation, no fear, only focus. The way it had always been. "Ligation ready?" he asked. "Yes, doctor," the nurse responded immediately. The surgery was delicate, but Benjamin's hands moved with unwavering precision. Every motion was executed with care, every decision calculated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he carefully excised the tumor. The moment it was removed, a collective breath was released throughout the OR. Benjamin glanced at the monitor. Carla's vitals remained stable. She had made it through. And so had he. Aftermath. Hours later, Benjamin stood outside Carla's recovery room. Tasha was pacing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The moment she saw him, she froze, her eyes wide with anticipation. Benjamin pulled his mask down, revealing the tired lines on his face. "She's going to be okay," he said simply. Tasha let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Then, before he could react, she threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. He stiffened at first, unused to the contact, but slowly, hesitantly, he lifted a hand and placed it gently on her back. "She's really okay," she whispered against his shoulder. "She'll need time to recover," he admitted. But yes, the surgery was a success. Tasha pulled back, tears streaming down her face, a relieved smile breaking through her exhaustion. "I knew you could do it," she said. Benjamin swallowed hard, something shifting inside him. For the longest time, he had believed he was nothing more than a ghost of the doctor he used to be, a man who had lost his purpose, his drive. But standing here, feeling Tasha's gratitude, knowing he had saved her mother, he realized something. He hadn't lost that part of himself. He had just buried it. And now, it was coming back to life. A new beginning. 3 days later, Benjamin walked into Carla's hospital room. She was awake, propped up on pillows, her skin already regaining some of its color. Tasha sat beside her, feeding her small bites of fruit from a tray. The moment Carla saw him, her face lit up. "Dr. Foster," she greeted warmly. Benjamin allowed a small smile. "How are you feeling?" Carla exhaled softly, "Like I've been given another chance." He nodded. "That's because you have." Tasha looked between them, her expression unreadable. Then she set down the tray and stood. Dr. Foster, she said carefully, stepping closer. I want to ask you something. He raised an eyebrow. What is it? She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. What are you going to do now? Benjamin exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. It was a question he had been asking himself since the moment he stepped out of the oar. Was this a one-time return to medicine? Or was it something more? He looked at Carla, at the life he had saved. At Tasha, at the girl he had saved all those years ago. At himself, at the doctor he had thought was gone. And he knew. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I think I'm not done saving lives. Tasha's smile was brighter than he had ever seen it. Good, she said. Because the world still needs you, Dr. Foster. For the first time in 15 years, Benjamin Foster believed it too. And this time, he wasn't going to run from it. The doctor reborn. 3 weeks had passed since the surgery that had saved Carla's life. And yet, for Dr. Benjamin Foster, it felt as if the world had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. The walls he had built around himself, the isolation, the grief, the guilt, had begun to crack. He sat on the porch of his home, staring out at the garden he had spent years tending, his hands resting on his knees. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant reds and yellows standing in contrast to the deep green leaves. For the first time in a long time, he realized something. This place, this retreat he had carved out for himself, had become his prison. He had convinced himself that he was at peace with solitude, that the world didn't need him anymore. But he had been wrong. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. He turned his head toward the sound, already knowing who it was. Slowly, he rose from his chair and walked toward the entrance. When he opened the door, Tasha stood there, smiling. She had become a regular visitor since her mother's surgery, and Benjamin had grown accustomed to the sight of her standing on his doorstep. But today, there was something different in her expression. Something determined. Hey, Dr. Foster, she greeted. Benjamin leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Tasha. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You look different. He smirked faintly. Older. She laughed. No. Lighter. Like you're not carrying so much weight on your shoulders anymore. Benjamin didn't respond right away, because she was right. Can I come in? She asked. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She walked into the living room, her gaze flicking over the shelves lined with old medical journals, the framed photos that had long since gathered dust, the house that felt more like a museum of the man he used to be. Benjamin followed her gaze. He had spent so long trying to forget who he was that he had ended up frozen in time. And now, Tasha was standing here, waiting for him to move forward. What brings you here? He asked, even though he already had a feeling he knew the answer. Tasha took a breath. I have a proposition for you. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. Oh, she smiled. You're a healer, Dr. Foster. No matter how much you tried to convince yourself otherwise. You saved me when I was a kid. You saved my mom. And now, I think it's time you start saving more people. Benjamin exhaled slowly. Tasha. No, just listen. She interrupted, stepping closer. I've been thinking about this for weeks. I know you don't want to go back to hospitals. I know you walked away from all of it. But what if you didn't have to go back to the old way of doing things? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? Tasha took out her phone and pulled up something on the screen before handing it to him. Benjamin glanced down. It was a proposal. A private medical practice. Not a hospital. Not an ER. A small, independent clinic. His brows furrowed as he skimmed through the details. You put this together. Tasha grinned. Of course. You're not the only one with a sharp mind, Dr. Foster. He chuckled despite himself. I'm serious, she continued. There are people out there who need someone like you. Someone who actually listens, who cares. You don't have to work 12-hour shifts in a hospital. You don't have to deal with administrative nonsense. Just medicine. just helping people. Benjamin's grip on the phone tightened slightly. This was something he hadn't considered. He had assumed that returning to medicine meant returning to everything he had walked away from. The overwhelming bureaucracy, the chaotic hospital halls, the pressure that had once consumed him. But this was different. Where would it be? He asked. Tasha's face lit up. There's an old medical office a few miles from here. It's been empty for years, but it's still in great condition. We could turn it into something amazing. We. Benjamin glanced at her. You say that like you're planning to be involved. Tasha grinned. I am. I want to be part of this, Dr. Foster. I might not be a doctor, but I know how to bring people together. I know how to make things happen. And I want to make this happen for you. Benjamin looked down at the phone again, scrolling through the proposal. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with something new. Something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He looked back at Tasha, who was watching him carefully. You really believe in this? He asked. She nodded without hesitation. I believe in you. Silence stretched between them. And then, for the first time in 15 years, Benjamin Foster made a decision. A real decision. He set the phone down on the table and looked Tasha straight in the eyes. All right, he said. Let's do it. Tasha's face split into the biggest smile he had ever seen. A new beginning. 3 months later, the doors of Foster and Wilson Medical Clinic opened for the first time. The sign outside was simple yet elegant, the name etched into the wood with quiet dignity. Inside, the space was warm and welcoming, a place designed not just for medical treatment, but for healing. Benjamin stood behind the reception desk, adjusting his white coat. He had forgotten how it felt to wear one. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt right. Tasha stood beside him, practically bouncing with excitement. Are you ready for this? She asked, grinning. Benjamin exhaled slowly and nodded. Yes, he said. And this time, he meant it. The final chapter. The Foster and Wilson Medical Clinic had been open for exactly 1 month, and already it felt like something Benjamin Foster never knew he needed. It wasn't the chaos of the ER, nor the sterile, lifeless halls of a hospital that had once been his entire world. Instead, it was his space, his patients, his second chance. A quiet hum filled the small clinic as he walked through the hallways. The walls were lined with framed photographs. Tasha's idea, of course. Some were of the people he had saved. Some were motivational quotes about resilience. And some were memories of Melinda, a reminder of the love that had once guided him. And now, he wasn't just surviving. He was living again. He passed by the reception desk, where Tasha was busy scheduling an appointment. She glanced up, catching his eye, and smiled. You're late for your first patient, she teased. Benjamin smirked, glancing at the clock. I'm exactly on time. She rolled her eyes. Close enough. He grabbed the clipboard off the desk and headed into the first exam room. Inside, a woman sat anxiously in a chair, her little boy, no older than 7, fidgeting beside her. The mother looked up the moment Benjamin walked in. Dr. Foster, she asked tentatively. He gave her a reassuring nod. That's me. What can I do for you today? She let out a breath, her worry evident. It's my son, Alex. He's been having trouble breathing at night, and I don't know what's wrong. We've been to other doctors, but they keep saying it's just a mild infection. Benjamin sat down across from them, his gaze immediately sharpening. Alex was pale, his small chest rising and falling unevenly. There was a subtle wheezing sound every time he exhaled. It wasn't an infection. Benjamin had seen this before. His gut instinct kicked in. Has he ever had an allergic reaction before? He asked. The mother frowned. Not that I know of. Benjamin nodded, already piecing the puzzle together. We're going to run some tests, he said calmly. But I have a strong feeling this isn't an infection. It's something deeper. And I promise you, we'll figure it out. The mother's eyes filled with relief. "Thank you, Dr. Foster." As he turned back to Alex, he saw something familiar in the little boy's wide-eyed expression. It reminded him of Tasha, the way she had looked at him 15 years ago, gasping for breath in the ER. This moment, right here, was why he had come back. This was what he had been missing. As he continued the examination, he felt the weight of his past lift just a little more. He wasn't the broken man who had walked away from medicine. He wasn't the doctor who had failed. He was Dr. Benjamin Foster, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. One last visit. That evening, after the last patient had left, Benjamin stepped outside the clinic. The sun had just begun to set, casting warm hues of orange and pink across the sky. Tasha stood next to him, hands on her hips. "Not bad for your first full month back." He chuckled. "I'd say it went better than expected." She nudged him playfully. "I told you, the world still needs you." Benjamin exhaled, looking out at the quiet street. He had spent so many years thinking he was done, that his time as a doctor had ended with Melinda. But now he understood. His story wasn't over. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to begin again. Tasha turned to him. "So, what now?" Benjamin smiled, the answer clear in his mind. "Now," he said, "we keep saving lives."